Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Last Week This Morning, where Mark and I recap the top stories from Energy Media last week. Well, it was a big week. We covered everything, and I'm going to start at the global energy pivot, which is now unstoppable. The international risk assessment firm DNV, released a new report, and I'd love it if you could talk us through that.
Well, you know what? What's really interesting, I've said this a million times, and I'm going to say it the million and first time today, is that when you get the energy conversation we're having in North America is very different than the one they're having in Asia, the one they're having in Europe. And DNV is located in Norway. That's where it's headquartered, and it has very much it's plugged into the energy transition kind of literature and theory and so on that we use here at Energy Media. So I interviewed Emma Goss, who's one of the researchers working on their annual energy transition report. And it's just so clear that the momentum is all around electrification, electrotech, and renewables. That's where the world is going. And the fact that it's not progressing as quickly in North America is explains a lot of why we look at the world through the lens that we do here in Canada and the United States, and we get it wrong. There's no question in my mind that we are still focused on either, we're big boosters of oil and gas, which you see in Donald Trump and even unbelievably in Mark Carney, our new prime minister,
Right.
or we're thinking about climate. And as a result, we completely miss this other trend that's going on about the electrification of the global economy and what that's going to do to oil and gas demand. So Emma she brought the receipts, right? There's data in there, lots of data, lots of sound theory, and it's a series of interviews. I think I did about 5 interviews with her. We've got the first 2 or 3 up. We'll have more of this. We'll have the rest of them this week. But watch those interviews because there's interesting insights into the electrification trends around the world.
Yeah, well, and we also talked a lot about China last week on the channel. And next up, I just want to dive into a little bit into your interview with Tim Buckley from the IEEFA. This one was This is How China Wins the World. Uh, so maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Tim Buckley is located in Australia, and he does investment analysis. And so for him, the last, I forget how many years, 10, 15 years, he's been going to China. I mean, that obviously
Hmm.
China dominates Australia's
Asia, yeah.
geopolitical view. I mean, they're kind of in China's orbit. So he goes over there
Hmm.
and he says, Markham, the scale of what they're doing is unbelievable. You have to be there on the ground to see how they're transforming and electrifying their economy as rapidly as they are. And I think this is part of the problem we have in North America is we don't do that. We don't go over there. In fact, I've never been to China. Uh,
Me either.
yeah, and so we're not physically impressed by the scale of change. And so we get it from data and expert interviews. That's where our perception comes from. But that was Tim's point. He says China is if you think the analogy here is after the World War II, when the United States came out of the war and they were the preeminent industrial power in the world. And that
Yeah.
industry was based on the internal combustion engine. It was planes, it was tanks, it was cars and trucks and motorcycles and all sorts of, then it was tractors, it was on and on and on. And the Americans perfected the factory system and they churned out these internal combustion engine based technologies at incredible volume and scale and at a low price. And so that enabled them, it gave them a huge economic advantage in production, and it really powered their ascent into geopolitical power from that point on. And so if
Yeah.
China is essentially in that from that perspective, China is copying the playbook. China decided 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, that electric technologies and advanced manufacturing was going to be the key to their economic growth and their geopolitical ambitions. And so that they're pouring all their resources into that. Now they're exporting out into the global south, in Asia, in Latin America, and increasingly in Africa. That's
Yeah.
their backyard is basically the rest of the world that the U.S. is vacating from under Donald Trump. So it's essentially the same playbook with a different set of technologies. And when you talk to somebody like Tim, who studies the economy of China, looking for investment opportunities that he can provide to his clients, you get a sense of just what China is doing and the magnitude of it and the speed of it. That's another thing. It takes North
Yeah.
American auto manufacturers 4 to 6 years to bring out a new model. It takes Chinese EV makers 18 months, and sometimes a lot
Yeah.
quicker because they're iterating all the time, improving the technology. And it's the same kind of leap that we went from telecommunications technology to the internet in the 1990s. Internet
Yeah.
time was a big deal back in the day. It was formative time for me. And now we have China time. And we here in the West need to adjust our thinking about the energy transition and China's role in it.
Well, and I think the thing that came out of that interview for me was thinking about how, it's not only what they're exporting, but it's what they're developing nationally. They build a local manufacturing and research and development capacity, like you said, that we just aren't privy to, we don't think of it as much about. So it's interesting to think about, okay, so what are they planning next? Like they're exporting a lot right now, and they're making a huge impact, obviously in North America, but also in the global south. And what's next? Because they are constantly innovating.
What's
You
next is,
also,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going
I
to
was
talk
just,
about our next story, which is China's ruthless auto expansion strategy, and this was based on an interview with Michael Dunn. Now, Michael used to
yeah,
be in GM, and he was the head of GM in Indonesia so he spent most of his career in Asia in the
yeah,
automotive industry, and for a while now he's been an EV analyst and strategist, and if you follow him on X, formerly Twitter, because he provides data all the time. And his point is China is ready to eat the global automotive industry.
yeah,
It now has the capacity to manufacture 50 million cars a year. We are only going to sell 88 million this year. That gives them the capacity for what? 75%,
percent.
basically 70% of all automobiles. The days of Ford and GM and Stellantis and Toyota, and they are coming to an end. There's going to be consolidation and there's going to be a shrinking unless the West figures out how to respond to the challenge. And the point that Michael made, and can't say this enough, is that the China, the entrepreneurs and the policymakers are absolutely ruthless. These are not, nice, polite folks who are coming over here to compete with us. They want to kill our industries. I mean, literally, they
Yeah,
want to take them over and they want to be the dominant force within those industries. And he says, Markham, I go to China and there's just a tremendous energy and these CEOs, these executives are, they're on fire. They're taking over the world. And then I come back to the West, and for those, automakers who are plugged into it, well, they're in panic mode. They're
yeah,
absolutely behind closed doors. They are pulling out their hair and they've got flop sweats. It's that bad. And for the rest of us, he said, we're so complacent. We're used to being number one. We've been number one. Like if you're U.S. and Canada, we're kind of joined at the hip economically.
yeah,
We've been at the top of the food chain for the last 85 years.
yeah,
And we're about to be toppled from the top of the food chain by China if current trends continue, especially in automobiles. That's the entry point into global, an industry that they're taking over. So watch any of the interviews I do with Michael Dunn. You should watch them because Michael A knows and B is a very straight shooter. He doesn't mince words about what the threat is.
Well, he's always one of my favorite guests you have on. And every time you have him on, I learn about a new type of EV, that obviously is not at market yet, but like Xiaomi is new. I thought they were a cell phone manufacturer and to find out now they're making cars. I want to turn now towards Alberta and talk a little bit about Brian Jean.
Um, it's hard to I don't want to make this personal. I don't want to suggest that Brian Jean is corrupt. I don't want to suggest
Hmm.
that he's taking bags of cash. I don't want to suggest any of that. That is not what this is about. He is the symbol of what's wrong with Alberta politics and the oil industry. Because
Right.
the industry, as we discovered, the work we did in 2022 around unethical oil part two, where we looked at conventional oil and the Alberta Energy Regulator and environmental liabilities, and the absolutely unavoidable conclusion is that the regulator is captured. Now, what does capture mean? Capture means that the policymakers or regulators or politicians are elected or hired to look after the public interest, to represent the public interest. But when they become captured, they begin to conflate public interest with industry interest.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's what the regulator has been doing. And when you're enmeshed in it, you can't see. You just think that this is the norm. This is the best way. It's in Alberta's best interest. But when you pull back, as many of the experts that I interviewed did, they're looking at the industry from the outside, then the capture becomes unmistakable. It's inescapable. And my point was that Brian Jean is captured and the government is captured. Danielle Smith used to be an oil and gas lobbyist, for crying out loud.
Right.
And Brian Jean, the thing about Brian Jean is the extent to which he is second banana to Smith. He is weak. He's basically a cheerleader for the industry. He Smith leads on all of the major energy files. She does all of the press conferences. He's kind of in the background. He is a very weak energy minister. Now, one of the reasons I know this is because I've interviewed past energy ministers from Alberta, people like Ken
Hmm.
King, who was actually in the Redford government, Stelmach government. He was the energy minister who brought in the legislation that created the Alberta Energy Regulator in its current form. And I spent an hour with him one time out in his home in Salt Spring Island, and we talked this through. And he is a former public policy expert. That's what he spent his entire career inside the civil service, and his before he got elected as a politician in Alberta, and having a conversation with him about the intricacies of energy policy and politics and how to protect the public interest and how that the interplay with the oil and gas industry makes it difficult, but how former governments, in most cases progressive conservative governments, how they handled that conflict between public interest and industry interest. And you see the tension in the conversation and the ways that they structured legislation to try to cope with that. And then you look at Brian Jean, and he's a kid playing in an adult's game. He just hasn't got it. And really his role there, he's got his little pom-poms out and that's what his job is, yeah, yeah, rah, rah, ethical oil. And that during a time of intense change that we're seeing now at the global level and even at the national level in Canada, we're talking about pipelines and LNG and, energy corridors and carbon capture and store. I mean, this is a time when we need a really strong energy minister. Like Alberta
Yeah.
needs to have a strong energy minister with a clear vision of the future that can defend Alberta's interests and craft the policies and legislation that are necessary to help Alberta make this transition to an electric world. And instead, Brian Jean is just simply captured. I called him a, what did I say? Brian
Lapdog. You
Jean
called
is a
him a lapdog.
lapdog. Yeah, I mean that's essentially what it is. I mean
Yeah.
he's got all the influence, he's got all the bite of a lapdog. And we've seen him in operation now for a couple of 3 years, and there's no point sugarcoating it anymore, right? I mean, we may as
Yeah.
well just call a spade a shovel and call it like it is. He's a lapdog. He's captured, and he adds absolutely no value to. He's essentially a puppet that you can see Danielle Smith's fingers in his back. That's what he is. And so let's stop pretending that Brian Jean is any kind of influence around the cabinet table or that, he's important. He's a foot soldier. He does what he's told and he goes out you know, so anyway, I'm not a Brian Jean fan. And I think he does Alberta he thinks he's doing a great service for the province. He's defending the Alberta oil and gas industry from those predatory, Eastern Canadian policymakers in Ottawa that, want to shut down the oil sands, yada, yada. That's just not, that's an imperfect way of looking at this thing. It's very
Yeah.
partisan, it's very ideological, and it's just not true. And as a result, he's not doing a good service to Alberta. He's doing exactly the opposite because he's helping to prevent change when change is needed.
Yeah. Well, speaking of ministers, you also had Jenny Jeremy on talking about this grassroots recall campaign for the education minister. So maybe you could tell us a bit about that as well.
Well, here at Energy Media, while our focus is energy, we do apply our journalism model, which is basically revolves around interviews with experts
Hmm.
and occasionally with people like Jenny who are involved in various uh, political campaigns or activities. And so she's a former oil and gas geoscientist who worked in the industry for over 20 years and has a couple of kids in high school. And
Hmm.
her MLA is the Alberta Education Minister, Demetrius Nicolaides.
Hmm.
And she is so appalled at the way he's handled himself as both an MLA and as an education minister that she's leading a recall movement to get him recalled. Now, the mechanics of it are essentially that she needs roughly 16,000 signatures on a petition, and she'll start
Hmm.
collecting them. She has 3 months to collect them, and we'll see how that pans out. But I think what you're seeing is the beginning of pushback by Albertans against the Smith government. And it's especially important right now because, of course, there's a general teacher strike all across the province. 51,000 teachers are out on strike. And full disclosure, my daughter is a teacher in the Calgary Board of Education, and my son-in-law, her husband, also works for the CBE. So conflict of interest declared. Uh, but nevertheless, this is part of this pushback. I think we're going to see a lot more of it, and I think the teacher strike is symbolic. It's the first big pushback, and will be so. That's why we're covering it, and why it's of interest, and why Jenny's recall campaign is of interest.
Well, you also had law professor Sean Fluker,
Fluker,
uh,
yeah.
Fluker. Sorry, I didn't want to misspeak on that one. On the show, talking about teacher constitutional rights and what this might mean if the government goes back with this back to work legislation.
Yeah, that's the thing. Smith has said, I think, and I think if I'm not mistaken, her deadline is 10 days from now. And so
Hmm.
she said, if there's harm being done to children and parents, and what does that mean? Harm being done? Of course, they're out of school, and then the parents have to arrange childcare or take time off work. So, from that point of view, of course, there's harm being done. But then the
Yeah,
teachers argue that there's tremendous harm being done in the educational system.
yeah.
Classrooms of 30, 35, 40, 45 kids in it. Jenny, mentioned her son last year threw up in class because the temperature was plus 40 and he overheated and he vomited in class because he got sick. And all kinds of examples of this kind of
Yeah.
lack of resources. It's an under-resourced system that the
Yep.
critics argue. And so what Smith has said, we'll bring in back to work legislation. And then there's speculation that she would use the notwithstanding clause in order to protect it from constitutional challenge in the courts. And that's what I talked to Sean Fluker about. So he explains what the notwithstanding clause is, how it relates to charter rights, which includes unions under freedom of association, how that might all play out, and how the fact other provinces are also have gone to court to defend their use or potential use of the notwithstanding clause. So these are interesting times, right? And that's the old Chinese curse.
Hmm.
May you live in interesting times. These are interesting times. And we're trying to use our approach to journalism, which is interviewing experts to provide in-depth explanation of various news stories. And so this, I think, is one that we're going to be continuing to cover, and for no other reason. There's been a lot of gossip, and it's only gossip at this point. But maybe if the back to work legislation comes, there might be a general strike in Alberta, which would,
Yeah.
all the union members everywhere throughout the province go on strike. And that would really escalate. That would ratchet up the political tension for sure, and we'd have a showdown. So we're trying to get Gil McGowan, the president of the Alberta Federation of Labor, to come on and talk about the likelihood or the possibility of a general strike, and probably that'll be on our YouTube site later on today.
Yeah, that's great. And I just want to take this moment to mention to people, if you like what we're doing, if you like this model, please, like our videos, subscribe. And I can't say enough that sharing our videos with your friends really helps bring us new audience members. So if you can also do that, post one of our videos up on your Facebook, or share it on Twitter or your YouTube channel, whatever it may be. We really appreciate that. And of course, if you want to support our channel, you can also join as a member. Last week we had a members only webinar. We're going to have some more of those. I'm actually planning on having some guest speakers at our next webinar. So, take that moment to join as a member, and you get some exclusive content as well. And Mark, I want to hand it over to you. Is there anything that you wanted to tell folks before we wrap up?
I do, because what we're seeing with the energy transition, and keep in mind that I've been doing this for over 10 years, reporting on the energy transition. And interesting little story, because I was just interviewing Dan Walter from Ember Energy, and we were talking about how our perception of the energy transition from 10 years ago is so different than today. So 10 years ago, I was actually arguing for a slow energy transition. And the reason for
Right.
that is because the experts I was interviewing in the United States and Europe and so on were all saying, no, 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 we're going to see the inflection point for these technologies in like 2035 and 2040. And lo and behold, they showed up in 2020. And
Yeah.
about 2016, 2017, I remember, I was watching, with the stories and the data and going, hey, hang on a second, something's changing here. This things are starting to accelerate. And then I remember talking to experts and saying, well, what do you think are we seeing an acceleration of the transition? Some said yes, some said no. By 2018, you couldn't deny it. It was already, the acceleration had begun. And in 2020, you have hit the inflection point for solar and wind and so on. And at that point, since the last 5 years has been an absolute, we're on the hockey stick growth, and it's
Acceleration.
transforming the global energy system. So here's the point I'm getting at for those of you who are still with us. This is a uh, structural change. It is an existential crisis for Canada, because the old economy that we had, that was plugged into oil and gas and providing natural resources, to the United States, is coming to an end. We don't know how. It's not going to end tomorrow, and it's not going to be 100% end, but things are going to be different, very different. And it's not just because Mark Carney is going to open up markets in Asia and Europe. It's because there are structural changes coming to the economy driven by new technologies, AI, electric vehicles, batteries. I mean, on and on and on. Things are different. And Canadians are still locked into a conversation about energy that's about 10 years old. We're about 10 years
Yeah.
behind the time in how we think and talk about energy. And if you're thinking and talk, and I would include Tim Hodgson, the federal minister of energy. I would include
Hmm.
Danielle Smith, the premier of Alberta, and I would even include Mark Carney. He may be the climate guy, but he's not the energy guy. And I think that Mark Carney is actually not as well versed in energy matters as we think, and which is why he's going on about, conventional energy and building pipelines and LNG and all of that kind of stuff. So what I'm getting at is our videos are really important. And I say that not because we did them. I say that because they bring a view of the energy future that you will not get anywhere else in Canada. There are very, very, very few people who even, are plugged into this trend. Max Fawcett over at the National Observer is one.
Yep.
There are a few in think tanks scattered around here and there, but it's not common, and nobody is undertaking the kind of explanation of these trends that we are. And so you can go to our YouTube channel and look at our, 2,000 videos that we've done explaining various aspects of it from the Canadian point of view. Very often, share them with your friends and family and your networks, because we need to change the conversation in this country as quickly as we can. There's a lot at stake here. We're not playing for marbles anymore. This is the real thing. And so that's my final wrap up for today, is to ask our viewers, share our videos, engage with your family, with your coworkers,
Yeah.
with your network on social media, engage in the conversation, and you know, our videos will give you the ammunition.
Yeah. Well, great. And I also just forgot to say, hit the bell so you get the notifications here on YouTube, because Markham and I are planning on going live with some breaking news this week as well. So thanks, folks,
Indeed.
for tuning in, and we will see you next week.
We will indeed.